News Talk 1400 KFRU is proud to present the KFRU Heritage Series. It's a one-hour perspective on the events and the people whose lives have contributed to the heritage of Boone County. Listen each Sunday at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. The KFRU Heritage Series. From News Talk 1400 KFRU.
Our Heritage program has given us the opportunity to explore a lot of different personalities, persons with different connections to the community, and I think that you're going to be interested today in the direction that we go with our guest. We have had, bank managers on, bank executives. We have had educators on. We have had retired judges. We've had a fire official on, a battalion chief on with us, and I could go on and on with the different types of personalities that we've introduced our listeners to on the Heritage program. And today we're going to talk to Mark Heim. First of all, welcome. How are you?
Good evening or good day. Very good to be here with you.
If I were to introduce you, and I purposefully did not ask you this before turning on the microphone because I wanted to have it on the mic as we got started to do, many people would say, and there are probably people right now thinking, oh, Mark Heim, I know him from PeaceWorks or from peace organizations. Tell us briefly in an introduction what you do, how you describe, how would you introduce yourself to someone who says, well, what do you do?
Well, I'm a community educator and activist. I work on a variety of issues: sustainability, energy, peace, economic and social justice issues, environmental issues are key amongst those issues. And somebody who's made my life here in Columbia, Missouri. I've been here for the last 40 years, and I've been in a number of different roles over those years. But for the last 27 years, I've worked full-time with the Missouri PeaceWorks and the nonprofit groups that are under the PeaceWorks umbrella, including the nonprofit Peace Nook, our bookstore and resource center, including our Center for Sustainable Living, our Missourians for Safe Energy group, the Columbia Earth Day Coalition, which is a coalition of groups but under our incorporation. So I do a variety of different things, but it involves everything from organizing events to holding conferences, a sustainable living fair each fall, Earth Day each spring, primarily trying to raise awareness and bring about progressive change.
So somebody would say, then how do you make a living? In other words, do you make a living off of sales at Peace Nook or through donations? What's that?
Yeah, but both of those are sources of fundings. PeaceWorks is a grassroots membership organization. There are between 400 and 500 households, individuals or families, who support us with annual donations. And when the store is bringing in sales, any revenue that is accrued above the cost of operation goes to our educational programming, including our general overhead of an organization and staff salaries. So, sure, that's where the money comes from. We don't get government grants. We don't get funding from any big foundations. It's grassroots.
Many people who are listening, I want to go back to this again. They've already made up their minds about who it is that is organized in this community for peace purposes. What do you say to those who tune that out and identify and stereotype those who would support matters that are very important to you?
Well, we live in a culture and a society in which people are, from the time of childhood, taught to essentially accept our foreign policy as being a benevolent one and being one that is supporting freedom and democracy around the world. Many of us who've looked closely at this have come to very different conclusions. And I think these days more and more people, even people on the right, are starting to come to different conclusions. And if you look at things like the war in Afghanistan, 2/3 of the public right now would like to see that war ended as quickly as possible. And when you think about how opinion changed over the war in Iraq from the time that the Bush administration launched that war in 2003 until we finally withdrew our combat troops in the last couple of years, it's been a sea change. And the amount of money we're spending on a military budget right now is crowding out expenses that are needed for things that people value. So I think that there's been real change in people's attitudes towards our military budget and towards war and peace. But, there's still a reflexive rally around the flag and supporting the troops, which becomes a code word for supporting foreign policy, whether that foreign policy is in the interest of the troops or the country or not.
Let me ask you this. Let's get away. I mean, I respect what you're saying, and I think many people would engage you in conversation about that. I'm going to go back in the tone of what we do as a heritage series. This is a philosophical question. Why is it necessary that a community like Columbia, or maybe any community, have a presence of those who believe deeply in speaking out about policy, foreign policy, or military presence, or sustainability? How do you philosophically say to people, you know what, you may not agree with me, you may not like me, you may not like what I stand for, but there's something important about me and about those like me being here?
Well, David, I'd start with something a bit more basic. I think the essence of a democratic society is our acceptance and our embrace of diversity of opinion. And I think that not so much talking about my opinions or my point on the spectrum of opinion, but rather more generally talking about democracy. We don't live in a monotone, uniform, everybody has to think the same way kind of a society. We don't have a one-party state. And I think that part of our strength as a society is that we embrace a variety of different perspectives and engage in public discourse. And the role that people like myself play is to hopefully encourage a robust dialogue on important issues. So whether we're talking about things like what's going on right now in our community over EEZ and blight, or whether we're talking about issues of public transportation, or you can go down the list, whether it's issues related to sustainability and choices that we're making there. All of these issues deserve, and the public deserves, democracy deserves, robust discussion. Now, I've involved myself around energy issues quite a bit. I think it's essential, living in a world in which we are heavily dependent on finite and polluting energy sources, that we engage that question. What are we going to do to get beyond fossil fuels? They are finite. Virtually everybody agrees with that. They are causing environmental problems. Virtually everybody agrees with that. Climate change, there are people who deny it, but the vast majority of the scientific community recognizes that our burning of carbon-based fuels is fueling climate change. So where do you go? Well, that's where you need a public debate. You can't just let the oil companies and utilities make decisions about this, because they make decisions in the interest of their stockholders and their bottom line, not in the interest of the ratepayers, the consumers, and the environment. So that's why you need an informed and engaged public citizenry.
How do you I'm going to again, Mark Heim is our guest, and you know him from various roles that he has played in this community. How do you direct yourself each day when you wake up in the morning? I don't think you go off and clock in. You may go to the Peace Nook and say, well, we're open for business, please come browse, see what we have. How do you direct yourself? What's your
in general? I don't staff our store,
Sure.
although I pitch in and help as needed, and I cover a couple of lunch hours a week. And when somebody goes on vacation, I sometimes pick up a shift there. But my main activities are focused on event organizing, public education, and some of the administrative functions of the organization.
Sure.
So, I'm essentially kind of self-directed, I'd say. I don't have a boss who tells me, okay, you got to go do this at 11. But I have a calendar. I write things down. I make a list of what I have to do, like most people who have a lot to do. And, I try and get done as much as I can. And often it gets to be after midnight. I'm still there, When I go
do you
home,
have an office? I mean, where do you work from?
Yeah, there's an office in the back of the Peace Nook where I work out of, yeah. And I do some of my work at home. I have a computer and the internet at home. So I got up this morning. I didn't need to be here until we got together to do this interview. So I was working on the computer at home.
And so you're looking at sources, looking at ideas, seeing
everything from putting stuff up on websites and Facebook to responding to emails to doing research to organizing events, calling people, lining up people to do various tasks. That's the kind of thing you do when you're an activist.
I'm curious. I think many people are probably curious, thinking an activist. How does an activist know what to do next?
Well, I'd say it's kind of like an iceberg in some ways. The part you see is a very small percentage of what a person does. And, we do public events periodically, whether it's peace gathering on the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing, whether it's a 9/11 commemoration, which we'll be doing in September, a sustainable living fair, which is also coming up this year, September 9th. Those kinds of events that are out in the public are a very small percentage of the time, but many times they take weeks and months of organizing to be put together. So right now I'm working on getting details together for a sustainable living fair, lining up who the speakers are going to be, who's going to present the workshops, who's going to set up booths and have displays, things along those lines.
Yeah, that's the same thing with the radio. I mean, you might pull a shift of 3 hours and somebody says, so you get done at 9 in the morning, you're done for the rest of the day. Well, a lot of work goes in behind the scenes that people don't understand, and that would be the bottom part of the iceberg that sometimes is a lot bigger than what is the part that the people see that is very clear.
Yeah, and I know that too because I do a weekly radio show on the community radio station, KOPN, and for the 1 hour I'm on the air, I often spend 2 or 3 hours preparing, lining up guests, getting things in place. I'm aware of that one too.
Yeah, Mark Heim is our guest. Before we come up to our first break, I'm curious, we were talking before we started the program. I came from a small town in north central Missouri, came to Columbia. Columbia to me seemed a big place. You came from a opposite background. Where did you come from before you came
I grew up in the New York Metro. I went to college at State U of New York at Stony Brook, which is about 60 miles from Manhattan out on Long Island. And I did live in the big city and its suburbs for my first 22 years.
So what was that like? I mean, I can tell you, I was rural for the most part, and so a lot of people would be able to understand what it would be like to grow up in a small town where you had outdoor activities and did all kinds of those kinds of things in a small community and cruised the loop every once in a while. What's it like? What was influential to you in those first 22 years?
It's interesting because I got to ride the subways and the buses and be around the big city and go to museums and things like that. But in many ways, where I lived was neighborhoods. I lived in a neighborhood in New York City that was a housing cooperative that had been set up by a labor union, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, in which there was a great sense of community. And we had a co-op store and a co-op nursery school and a co-op day camp and a co-op healthcare plan. And those things were very supportive of a high quality of life for the residents, most of whom were working class folks. They were people from the needle trades, people who had jobs that weren't necessarily high skill and high pay jobs. They were relatively low paying jobs, and they were relatively hand to mouth to some extent, but there was a sense of solidarity and community, and that was great. When I moved to Long Island in sort of the suburban sprawling of the 1950s and 60s, I lived in a neighborhood again. It was a little less solidarity, but it was an interesting place to live. There were lots of nice people and a sense of connection to our neighbors. The main reasons I left the New York Metro, though, I just couldn't stand the size and congestion and pollution of the environment and the lack of a sense of real community when you got out in this bigger metropolitan area where you had to drive everywhere to get places, where there was so much time spent on freeways backed up in traffic. There was just so much congestion, and it seemed like there was much more potential for living more in harmony with nature out in a more less citified area. And when I first moved to Missouri, I actually thought I was going to be living in a more rural environment, actually. And as my life took its course, I ended up staying in town. I had initially been intent on doing sort of a back to the land thing, but as it worked out, I had other things in my future that I didn't realize.
We'll come back and talk maybe about some of those, and also I've got some questions about the direction that you see Columbia moving in regard to a comparison and contrasting with what you just described as to what led you out of the New York City. We need to take our break first. This is the Heritage Show. You're listening to News Talk 1400 KFRU. Our guest this week is Mark Heim.
This is the KFRU Heritage Series.
We're visiting this morning on the Heritage Program with Mark Heim. You'll know him from Mid-Missouri Peaceworks, from sustainability, and he's described already in some of our opening comments the work that he has done in this community. And we were talking before we paused for our announcements that his life changed when he came from New York City and then Long Island and then to Columbia. You talked about some of the things that you thought you wanted to get away from in New York City. Are you seeing Columbia moving towards that? You talk about needing a car to get around, the growth, the sprawl, the the size of what happens. I still think we're a small city, and it is still easy to get around fairly well, depending on where you plant yourself in Columbia. But do you see some similarities? Compare and contrast for us.
Well, I think the whole country over the last 4 decades has become very automotively based, and it's at a place where most people who are moving to Columbia now are getting homes or condos or apartments in places where they will end up driving to most places they go. I think that there are many people in the community, though. People work with the PedNet Coalition and other groups who are working to promote a more bikeable, walkable community, and I really like the idea of us being able to get around in a muscle-powered way if we're fit and able to do that. And I ride my bike as much as I can. There are times I get in my car and drive, though. It's a mix. I don't see Columbia becoming another New York City. What I really hope we don't become is another Denver or Phoenix or, sort of a Western U.S. style metro that is so sprawled out. I like the fact that there's some infill development going on now, that there are people building apartments closer to the central city. I think those are much more beneficial than having students who are on campus most of the day commuting back and forth from apartments that are several miles to the south of town.
When you came in the early 70s, who was here that you looked at as a leader of the community, as like now your name is associated with so much of sustainability or earth-friendly living or environmental consciousness or peace? Who was here that was influential in you deciding to come here? And my first part of this question is, had you ever been to Columbia or mid-Missouri before?
Well, I had a buddy from high school who came to college here, and I'd visited here several times before I moved here. I developed a set of friends, and I guess when I got here, I already knew a number of people. One of the things that's really interesting about my generation, the generation that came of age in the late 60s and early 70s, is we went through this alienation generation gap phenomena in which early baby boomers, didn't have that many role models who were older than us. It was the era of don't trust anyone over 30. So we didn't really look to our elders for, and that was a flaw, I think. I think we needed to learn from those who had gone before us. But there was a combination of factors. I mean, we were in the echo of the McCarthy era, in which a lot of people who had been involved in progressive politics had been silenced, had been, basically forced out of their political involvements, lost their jobs, blacklisted. So we had those kinds of issues going on as well, and that knocked out a lot of potential role models. I remember, though, there were several peace community leaders who were around at that time who were older. One person who just passed this year, John Shooter, took tremendous leadership. Quakers and Fellowship of Reconciliation were around and active in the 70s, and they were doing good work, and we teamed up on some things.
Most of what would have been protesting of the Vietnam War was over by the early 70s in Columbia. Is that true?
That is true. By the time I got here in the fall of 71, the war was being Vietnamized, it was winding down, and a lot of us who've been active in peace advocacy over the previous several years were starting to look at alternative institutions. And that was a lot of what I was interested in doing at that point. I came here to help start a food co-op, and that food co-op prospered over time and eventually came to its demise about 17 years later in 1988. But over the course of those 17 years, it did a lot of good in terms of creating community as well as providing a resource and access point for whole foods, natural foods, organic foods, bulk foods at a time when those weren't readily available otherwise. But, I think that a lot of what was going on at that point was people looking to create the alternatives, whether it was collectively run businesses, whether it was group living situations, whether it was alternative media. I was involved in a couple of what are sometimes called underground newspapers, alternative press. KOPN is a community radio station. It's also part of that alternative media that was getting started then. So there's a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of energy for creating those alternatives.
Give us a description of the alternative press, not so much KOPN, but I'm curious about underground newspapers in Columbia.
Yeah, I was involved in two of them. One was called Hard Travelin' Times, the title based on a Woody Guthrie song.
Yeah.
And one was called Community Sun. And each of them had a relatively short duration. I think the Hard Travelin' Times might have been around for 6 or 8 months, and Community Sun maybe for just a little bit longer than that. I think the Sun came out in 74 and 75. Hard Travelin' Times maybe in 72.
What was it like? I mean, how'd you put those out? What was it like, and what kind of news did you do?
The technology was much more primitive. We didn't do desktop publishing, I'll tell you that. We did a lot of cut and paste. And I remember we composed on an IBM Selectric typewriter, so we didn't have typeset copy, and we used those transfer letters to make the headlines. I don't know if you remember those, the rub-on transfers.
Sure, yeah.
So, the technology was primitive, but the content was very interesting, and a lot of this stuff's now over at the Historical Society.
So what kind of what mobilized people? What were they excited about?
We were talking about everything from lifestyle choices to energy issues to economic and social justice issues. I did a series of articles on energy. That was my first real dive into energy activism, was writing about coal and nuclear and alternative energy back in 74. And I remember I got in a debate with William Miller, who's now, he still is, over at the Nuclear Engineering Department at MU, a professor now. I think he might even chair the department, but he was a graduate student then, and we engaged in debate there on, in the Community Sun in 1974. So it was a vital time of interest in so many different issues, and it was food, nutrition were big issues, but so were basic societal directions and where we were going and how we were going to get there.
Was there a community, like a neighborhood? Did you live in a certain place, and did others like you live in that place? Where were you living at that point?
Well, I actually lived when I first got here, in a collective household out on the east side of town, about maybe 3 or 4 miles from downtown, out near where El Chaparral is on WW.
Yep.
But after I lived there for a couple of years, moved into town and lived on several different streets in the central city, Alexander Avenue and West Ash and North 7th Street and North 5th Street in town, and eventually ended up in Benton Stevens. I've been living in Benton Stevens neighborhood, where we are right now at the studio. I've lived here since 1979. So
is there anything similar in Columbia now to what you would remember 40 years ago in the early to mid-70s?
Oh, there's a lot that's similar, I mean,
I'm talking about the young people who are energized and mobilized. I don't know if there's an underground newspaper now. I know KOPN is around now, but I'm just curious as to, do you see young people that in your eyes are like you were 40 years ago?
Sure. I mean, obviously people were walking around with smartphones and posting on Facebook. We weren't doing that then. Yeah. But, you look at the Occupy phenomena. And there were lots of young people this past year who got involved in Occupy, and many of them still are active. And right now they're preparing for a big Occupy Missouri gathering here. So, essentially, you have a situation in which there's not as large a generational cohort as there was with the baby boomers, and there's much more intergenerational connection. We were inventing everything for ourselves because we weren't connected to older folks. When you look at the group of people who started KOPN, for instance, they started meeting in 72 and had a station on the air by 73. I doubt if there was anybody over 30 in that group. The older folks were guys in their late 20s, as I remember it. And most everybody was either in college or just recently out of college.
What was their dream for KOPN? What did they say that was going to be?
Well, I think part of what we saw was the fact that the major media was excluding voices of alternative viewpoints. And as such, it seemed important to have a venue and a vehicle for getting other ideas and other attitudes and information out there. And I think that was a lot of it. There was also, I think, a critique of the the monoculture of not just the mind, but of the the culture, the entertainment, the idea that you would have a station that is so tightly formatted in terms of one musical style. That's all you get, whether it's top 40 or, country or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And people wanted to have diversity. They wanted to have Celtic music, and they wanted to have, jazz and blues and soul, and, you go down the list, reggae and whatnot. And there was no radio station that was giving them that. So I think that was part of what was desired. And it was part of a movement that was going on all around the country, and still is, that people were trying to have more community-controlled media.
Mark Heim again is our guest on the Heritage Program on News Talk 1400 KFRU. I'm curious as to you talk about the 70s. What was it like during the 80s? What was you're always going to say that you've had a long interest in energy issues or sustainability issues or those kinds of issues. So that did not change in you, but what was happening around you, and did things change in the 80s? Was there a different atmosphere? Was it harder to do certain things in the 80s and the 90s as compared to the 70s?
Well, this continuous change, and it's hard to bracket things off and just say this decade was this and that decade was that, because the late 70s were very different from the early 70s and whatnot. That all said, I think that we did go through a period of sort of you might call it a loss of innocence. Many of us, I think, who got very active in the late 60s and early 70s were very hopeful. We were very idealistic and very hopeful, and we saw a much better society coming out of our efforts. And we saw the ability to transform things, and we thought rather rapidly. And as it turned out, some of the existing institutions, the large corporations and the bureaucracies that move things in a more or less constant way, proved to be much more resilient than we expected. And the pushback that came with the so-called Reagan Revolution of the early 80s was rather disheartening. We saw, rather than more economic justice, we saw tax cuts for the wealthy, and we saw cuts in the social safety net. That was disheartening. Rather than having our environment cleaned up and move to renewable energy, we saw a push for dirty energy and for ending environmental regulation. Reagan put people like James Watt in charge of the Interior Department, the guy who believed that the end of the world was at hand and would happen in his lifetime, and that we didn't have to take care of the environment. So we had a period in which our government got involved in covert wars in Afghanistan, in Central America, in Nicaragua, and aiding wars of repression with death squads in places like El Salvador and Guatemala. And it was a very depressing period, in many ways. That doesn't mean there wasn't struggle. It doesn't mean there wasn't activism. There was lots of it. I was involved in several initiative campaigns statewide in 1980 and 1984 that involved hundreds of volunteers, including, probably over 100 volunteers right here in Columbia. I was involved with...
What were those initiative campaigns for?
Well, we did Proposition 11 in 1980. That was a initiative that would have kept any utility from operating a nuclear plant in Missouri until they found a way to deal with nuclear waste, and showed they had that piece together, and had provided funding for the decommissioning of the plant at the end of its life. Incidentally, Ameren's predecessor, Union Electric, in 1980 said, no problem, this will be done in just a few years, don't have to vote for this. It's now 32 years later, they still don't have the nuclear waste issue cracked. So, it's we were somewhat prescient in seeing that this problem wasn't one that was easily going to go away. In 1984, it was the Ratepayer Protection Act. At the time that Ameren was about to bring Cowboy 1 online and was asking for a 70% rate hike, and Kansas City Power and Light was bringing Wolf Creek online out in Kansas, asking for a 65% rate hike. We were trying to get some consumer protection in there. Both cases, the utilities outspent us 30 or 50 to 1, and were able to, wipe the floor with us. But we literally. But that's what happens when you have all the money you can possibly want to spend on a campaign or fighting against a grassroots group. But there was a lot of positive things going on in terms of people organizing. The nuclear freeze movement that came out of the early years of the Reagan administration was very positive and empowering. And here in Columbia, the Nuclear Freeze Group got that question on the city ballot in '82 and got 59.5% of the voters voting yes for a mutual verifiable end to the nuclear arms race. And that went on in states all across the country, and it was a very exciting and empowering time.
I'm going to take our break here a little bit early so we can add an extra minute to our last segment rather than to start into some other questions. But stay with us. We'll be back after these announcements. More with Mark Heim as we continue this morning on our Heritage program on News Talk 1400 KFRU.
This is the KFRU Heritage Series.
Our final segment of our visit on the Heritage program with Mark Heim today on News Talk 1400 KFRU. We'll hit some odds and ends in the next in this segment. It's our shortest of the three segments. One is, do you remember the first thing that you protested? You went out and physically protested with a sign in Columbia, and how, I don't know whether you did that a lot in New York before you came to Columbia or not.
Well, I was involved in a lot of protests in New York on campus and elsewhere. I was also involved in several of the national anti-war demonstrations during the Vietnam War down in D.C. The first protest or demonstration I took part in Columbia was before I moved here. I was visiting. This was in 1970, and a group of students were protesting the parietal rules, the rules that kept male and female students from visiting each other in their dormitories. And I joined a group that was doing civil disobedience, going into a dormitory and essentially challenging the unisex no visitation rule.
So what was the outcome of that?
A group of us went up in the elevator, and I don't remember exactly what happened, but I think we were escorted to the door at some point. But it was this was 1970, and most campuses around the country had already gotten to a situation where dormitories were integrated so that men and women could enter them together and spend time with each other in their dormitory rooms. And here it was much more limited. Even when I got here in 71, a year and a half later, it was still limited, but they had larger visitation hours. And later on, I think they loosened up. I don't know exactly where things stand now. I don't hang out on the campus nearly as much as I did back then.
Well, sure. How many times have you been arrested for your protest?
I've never been arrested.
Uh-huh.
People find that surprising.
Uh-huh.
I think there are times when civil disobedience is required. I think there are times when it is desirable and other times where it's not. And, I think that if you have a situation in which direct action can actually change something, like when lunch counters were integrated in the South, I think then direct action certainly makes sense. I think when you can bring attention to an issue that's otherwise not getting attention, then it certainly makes sense. On the other hand, if the issues you're working on are ones that are getting plenty of attention, sometimes you just distract attention away from your issue and to your tactics. And most of the issues I've been working on over the years are ones that are getting plenty of attention. So I have not chosen to do civil disobedience. I did some back in the late 60s and early 70s around anti-war stuff, but was never arrested for them.
Mm-hmm.
I was part of the big May Day protests in D.C. in the spring of 71, at which tens of thousands of people were in the streets saying no to the war, but I wasn't arrested in those protests.
Is Columbia a pretty tolerant community? I mean, they'll see you, they know you, even if they don't know you. There are certain names that are associated with certain parts of our community here, and your name, Mark Heim, people would associate with a certain thing. So they would expect you maybe to be in front of the library on the corner here, not the library, the post office or someplace. So they might expect you some places. Whether you're there or not, they still put you there in their minds. Are we a pretty tolerant community?
I think in general, yes. I think in general, Columbia is a polite and friendly community. I think there's obviously individuals who are less so. And it just depends on the times. Right after 9/11, there were lots of people feeling very frightened, very vulnerable, and very angry. And during that period, right after 9/11, there was a lot of hostility expressed to peace advocates. That's changed over time. There are many more people who drive by Broadway and Providence now who give a full peace sign. That takes 2 fingers. Than people who just give half a peace sign.
I know.
So it used to be somewhat different. Back in 2003, some people just hadn't figured out it took 2 fingers to make a peace sign yet.
The when you, I think, does the group around you change? Do you see it evolve? There are some old timers that I think of that are regulars that I think. Are there new people that are coming up through the ranks that are also filling the spots of the old ones who no longer choose to or can do it?
Sure. There's a constant change, there's a constant evolution in who's active and who's active around which issues. I know people who I've known for decades who are in leadership roles in peace and environmental groups, in community media groups and things like that, but there's always new people active. And I treasure, the people who make lifetime commitments to change. I think of people like Hank Ottinger, who's been a leader in Sierra Club since I met him in the late 70s. It's people like that who really dedicate a significant portion of their lives to making change. And sometimes it's very behind the scenes. I have a colleague at PeaceWorks named Kim Dill, who's been active since she was just out of college in 1996. So she's been active for 16 years now. She does desktop publishing, composing, does all sorts of behind-the-scenes stuff. Isn't very public. She might be embarrassed I mentioned her name on the radio, not because she's embarrassed to be involved, but just sort of shies away from getting credit. But she's a committed activist in her way. And I think you need people who commit to these issues and really work hard at them over time and recognize that the kinds of changes that back in the 70s we thought might happen in a few years are more going to take decades, and we need to be thinking about who's going to come after us. I'm in my early 60s now. I'm not going to be doing this forever. I know I'm mortal, and I know at some point I need to back away, and at some point life ends.
Do activists have retirement plans?
PeaceWorks doesn't provide me with one, I'll tell you that.
I think you probably had a pension.
No 401k. I'm hoping they don't take our Social Security away. Depending on how the election turns out, they might be pushing that.
Give us an example of a victory, something that is an accomplishment that keeps you going. And you say, you know what, it may take a long time for what I'd like to see to happen in society to happen, but something like this gives me hope.
Well, there's so many little things. Back in 1979, I was involved in organizing a group called Citizens for Recycling here in town. We had no recycling in town at that point, and we worked at it. It took several years. We got drop points. We ended up getting blue bags. We started in certain neighborhoods. Eventually, it went community-wide. So things do happen. Things do change. I wish I could point to more substantial victories on the big picture stuff. When you look at war and peace, unfortunately, we seem to have developed a permanent war economy where for 7 decades since the beginning of World War II, we have been on a wartime footing, whether we're actually at war or not. We're spending so much money on our military and engaging in operations in every continent, every ocean, all around the world. That kind of thing makes it such that you've got to keep plugging. And it's a victory even when the public attitude changes on a war that starts off being popular and people realize, hey, this wasn't such a good idea. And you hope people will sometimes get the idea at some point that permanent war isn't a good idea and that maybe 4.5% of the world's people should have a military budget that's 4.5% of the world's military spending, not over 40%.
People would hear what you say and they understand your politics and then they understand your points. They would say, gosh, though, you are Mr. Heim, you're just batting against huge corporations, huge military complexes. You're and people kind of just say, well, you all, this small little group, just go ahead, do your little peace protest or do your peace ideas, but you can't change what is so large. How do you respond to those?
That's a vicious cycle because the more people who believe that, the fewer people who are active, and the fewer people active, the less we accomplish. What we need to do is instead of engaging in that sort of downward cycle, we need to engage in an upward cycle in which people get a sense, well, yes, we can change some things. Yes, we can stop some injustice. Yes, we can achieve some things that are good. And at the very least, we need to come together and experience solidarity and recognize that there are many of us who feel this way. And that's why I'd encourage people to get active around whatever issue they feel concerned about.
We have 2 minutes left. Where's your optimism come from on these points?
Well, part of it is that whole notion that Martin Luther King espoused, that while the arc of justice, while the arc of the universe is long, it bends towards justice, and that in the long run, we wake up and we change. And you look at the struggles, things like women's suffrage. They started in 1848. It took till 1919 to get that passed. It was like 70 years. You look at the abolition of slavery and ultimately the civil rights movement. We're talking about things that took many decades, and in the case of civil rights, over 100 years after the Civil War till we finally passed Voting Rights Acts. It takes a long time. Labor unions started organizing in the U.S. in the 1840s. It wasn't until the 1930s that we were able to pass the Wagner Act. And, it takes a long time. But in the long run, things do change for the better. I look at LGBT rights, which just a few decades ago, that was all in the closet. People weren't even talking about it. And now we've got a half dozen or more states that have legalized same-sex marriage. And we have much more acceptance of people's sexual orientation than we did, even a decade ago. And I see change happening in a positive way. I stay hopeful. I know that, things aren't necessarily going to go the right way. Climate change is very threatening. Nuclear war is still a real threat. There's lots of injustice in our society. But you got to stay hopeful and you got to keep working at it.
I'm so glad you were our guest. You support a lot of ideas that a lot of people need to think about, and you give them a lot of food for thought. I'm glad you're a part of our community, and thanks for being a part of our show.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me on.
Mark Heim has been our guest on the Heritage Show on News Talk 1400 KFRU.
You've been listening to the KFRU Heritage Series, celebrating our history and heritage of Columbia and Boone County. Listen each Sunday at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. The KFRU Heritage Series. News Talk 1400 KFRU. Columbia. 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 Columbia.